Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the symposium, Writing the Horizon, Recent Essays on Cuban Art. This conversation is part of our closing celebrations for the exhibition On the Horizon, Contemporary Cuban Art from the Jorge M. Pérez Collection. And this has been a wonderful experience of engaging this collection that was given to us in December of 2016 and that we continue to build upon. Jorge Pérez gave us over 170 works of contemporary Cuban art, as well as funds to acquire additional works. And for this exhibition project, we acquired maybe 6 or 7 works altogether, and we'll continue to build on this collection. Today, we called it Writing the Horizon. We really want to focus on sort of the scholarship that we commissioned as part of this project. And we invited 3 scholars to each take on one of the thematics of the 3 chapters that comprise the exhibition. The structure that emerged, I mean, I looked at the collection and when we got it and sort of started studying the collection, and it really felt like an opportunity to show the collection in smaller thematic groupings as a way to kind of delve deeper into the works themselves, all under this overarching theme of On the Horizon, which I'll talk a little bit about as a thematic. And one of the things we have done with this exhibition is there's a concentrated gallery that has changed 3 times, and then there are also works that have been placed throughout the permanent collection. So it's a way to show how we'll be engaging this collection in the future through small exhibitions, but also integrated into our overall holdings. And this notion of scholarship or really delving into the works themselves, delving into the thematics that emerge from the works is another part that of engagement, long-term engagement that we want to continue with the collection. I want to mention briefly, just before I introduce everyone, just a little bit about kind of some of the ideas around the notion of on the horizon, or why I decided to choose this theme. It's kind of engaging the horizon line as kind of a structuring element was really a way to provide a very open and poetic and metaphorical framing for looking at this group of works in the collection. And it was specifically a strategy to sort of leave a lot of space for the works to resonate in each of these kind of subgroupings as well, really focusing on what the works have to say about contemporary culture, politics, personal feelings, versus trying to articulate an overarching art historical trajectory or political ideology in any way. The works themselves do that and position themselves in various ways, but we wanted to kind of create a frame that was sort of porous and nodded more towards the poetry and the aesthetics themselves in each of the artworks. Also, the idea of the horizon line structures this notion of a position of viewing or viewpoints, structuring a viewpoint. And the horizon line, speaks, of course, to the geography and of Cuba itself, or sort of looking from the island outward to the States and beyond. But it also, the horizon line in this case could be seen, we could be thinking about looking from Miami back to the island. So it kind of has this ambiguous relationship about where you're speaking from from within, the island itself, or from the diaspora looking back. And this collection is quite interesting in the way that it mixes artists working, in many generations, of Cuban artists, and also artists working on the island, working in the diaspora, working in Miami, working in other parts of the world, but also artists who move fluidly between these spaces as well. And that the Horizon Line was a way to kind of embrace that sort of ambiguity about how we define who is a Cuban artist, which the collection really performs in a dynamic way. And then the other thing I wanted to mention about the Horizon Line, it's sort of the act of viewing in front of the horizon kind of has this multiple temporalities related to it. When you're standing, it becomes metaphorically that you are kind of standing in the present, your past is behind you, and the future is ahead of you. And that kind of multiple reading of time feels very coherent or in dialogue with how we discuss Cuban art or Cuban culture in general. That sort of looking to the horizon implies that kind of future, that potential or elusive future that is always involved in discussions around Cuba about since the revolutionary period or even before, but this idea of there's this eminent cultural change and that always kind of hangs over discussions around Cuba. So and Cuban art production. So just that as a brief introduction. And then kind of studying the collection, there were a lot of images of horizon lines that sort of serve as anchors for these 3 chapters that then emerged. Really looking at the works themselves, these 3 thematics came out of that. And internal landscapes that really, the first chapter, I'll talk about those maybe I'll run through these quickly, just to remind people who haven't seen the show. The chapter 1 was really focusing on the horizon line and relationship to the body and kind of landscape as kind of a psychological space as well as a physical space. These are some examples of the works that certain works stayed throughout the 3 chapters and could be read differently with each of these thematics. This Joan Capote piece became has been, sort of a signature piece for the show. And it's interesting because it can be read as a simple landscape, or it can be read as an abstraction, or also as a kind of a social commentary, because it's made up out of these fish hooks and talks about the sea as the sea between Miami and Cuba as a space of danger and perilous sea journeys. Thomas Esson's piece was also shown in each of the chapters. But just to give an idea, again, a lot related to the body in landscape, the body as a space, like a psychological space, a lot of using the body to talk about spiritual questions, about popular culture, religion, thinking about sort of the landscape here, like the sea landscape with Savino's floor piece, is kind of making references to waves. Other works talking about the exile experience, or the balseros crossing. Sandra Ramos talking about sort of this moment of traveling, or the special period and people leaving the island. So chapter 2, just kind of emphasizing that certain works stayed. In chapter 2, abstracting history, really looking at different ways that contemporary artists and historical figures are addressed abstraction. Here's Ilya Sanchez, her works from the 70s. Rosabal, like a recent work, but he's a historical figure since the 60s. Ballard, like looking at real reduced forms of geometric abstraction, thinking about abstraction and abstracting, like the history of geometric abstraction in Cuba and how it resonates to today, but also how artists take historical material and abstract them to create commentary on the political situation or questioning history in different ways. Just go quickly here. And then chapter 3, which was currently on view, domestic anxieties, thinking about sort of everyday stresses, living on and off the island, but also looking at domestic spaces, looking at architectural spaces, like urban environments in Havana and elsewhere, but also the anxieties of being a Cuban artist in the art world is referenced in many of these, or thinking about dissidence, or how to be a dissident in this wall drawing by Lázaro Saavedra, thinking in sort of kind of creating a flow chart about different methods or how to be a dissident, or like today. Just kind of running through some of those, but so just that's to kind of remind people of the different parts that made up this project. This project closes tomorrow, and so we're kind of celebrating the 3 chapters today, and we're creating a book of the show, and it will include the different parts that were part of the show. We did several talks related to each of the openings. We did several performances, and we did a collaboration with the Miami Film Festival with a series of films related to each chapter as well. So, and part of that these chapters was, and for the book, was to invite each of these scholars here today to take on one of the thematics and really look at the works in that chapter, but also kind of jump off that in different directions. And they each approach these thematics and the works in those chapters in very different ways. So and another thing I wanted to mention, the book also contains short text on each of the works that have been presented, and there were 3 writers that each wrote on every single work in that chapter, which I want to mention them here. It's Unekis, I always say Uni's name. Unekis Villalongo wrote on all the works in chapter 1, and Marianela Alvarez wrote on chapter 2, and Tanya Hernandez wrote on chapter 3. I'm not sure if they're here with us today, but they really did great research on each of the works, and that'll be something that will be shared in the book as well. But to all of you, thank you for being here today, and I'll introduce each of you, and then we'll speak in order from chapter 1 to chapter 2, chapter 3, and then we'll open up to questions between us, and then we'll open it up to all of you to ask some questions. So to start with, Anelys Alvarez Munoz, she's an art historian who earned her BA and MA degree in the University of Havana in Cuba. In 2010, she completed her graduate program in museum studies at Florida International University, where she also served as a consultant for the Frost Museum of Art and the Cuban Research Institute. Alvarez Munoz has taught at the University of Havana between 2005 and 2010, and the Technological Institute of Monterrey, Mexico in 2013 and 2014. She writes and lectures on Cuban art, and she's the assistant curator of the Related Groups collection, and has been very involved in building this collection, working closely with Jorge Perez, she's been a great resource for us in building it and welcoming the collection into our holdings at the institution. Rachel Price is associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Princeton University. She's the author of articles on digital media, slavery, poetry, and visual art, and the books The Object of the Atlantic, Concrete Aesthetics in Cuba, Brazil, and Spain, 1868 to 1968, which is published by Northwestern University Press in 2014. And in 2015, her book, Planet Cuba, Art, Culture, and the Future of the Island was published by Verso Books, both amazing publication, very interesting research. She's currently working on several projects, including intersections between aesthetics and energy, and a book-length study, Rethinking Communication Technologies and Literature in the 19th Century Slave-Holding Iberian Atlantic. Very interesting. And then we have Jorge Duany, Dr. Jorge Duany, who's the director of the Cuban Research Institute and professor of anthropology in the Department of Global and Social Cultural Studies at Florida International University. Born in Cuba and raised in Panama and Puerto Rico, Dr. Duany previously served as acting dean of the College of Social Sciences and professor of anthropology at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. He also served as chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and director of the Journal of Revistas de Ciencias Sociales in UPR. He has held visiting research and teaching appointments in several U.S. universities, including Harvard, Connecticut, Wisconsin, Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and the City University of New York. He earned his PhD in Latin American Studies, specializing in anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. He holds an MA in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago and a BA in Psychology from Columbia University. He's published extensively on migration, ethnicity, race, nationalism, and transnationalism in Cuba, the Caribbean, and the United States. He has also written about Cuban cultural identity on the island and in the diaspora, especially as addressed in literature, music, and religion. So thank you all for being here, and we'll start with Anelys' presentation.
Thank you, Tobias. Thank you all for coming, and it's a pleasure to be here and to be part of this publication, and also to be part of this panel together with Duany and Rachel Price. I wanted to start by sharing with you some of the ideas that I use as the base to analyze this first chapter of the exhibition, Internal Landscapes. And the starting point of my research was the essay, The Body as a Narrative Horizon, by Professor of Philosophy Gail Wise, unsatisfied with the dualistic model that contraposes the body as a biological material versus the body as a cultural text, Wise questions what would be the ontological standing of the body, or the place where the cultural and also biological elements interact with one another to create a sense of integrity. It is in the context of that discussion that she proposes the idea of narrative horizon, for all the texts and for all the stories that we tell about ourselves. The attempt to put this notion of narrative horizon in context lead me also to review the phenomenological tradition that consider the horizon is not a fixed, univocal notion, but a multiplicity informed by our past, our present, and future experiences, and also by our perceptions and our personal and shared memories as well. Philosopher Edmund Husserl considered that every object has both internal and external horizon. Therefore, the horizon is simultaneously in connection with the external space and also the internal psychological private space as well. And these were some of the ideas that are in the base of my research when I first approached this exhibition, Internal Landscapes, the first chapter of this tripartite project that Tobias was presenting or reviewing with us today. This particular iconography of the island presents a release of 4 generations of Cuban artists, starting from artists like Madiba or Favelo, or other artists who have been working like Julio Larraz, who have been active in the 1970s, to a younger group that is represented by Hernan Vaz, Joan Capote, Elizabeth Savino, or Antonia Wright, among other artists who have begun their careers in the 80s or the 90s. This coexistence of at least 4 generations of Cuban artists reveal myriads of symbols that evoke the island, its history, and sociopolitical dilemmas in a very particular way. In the difficult circumstances of the special period, that euphemistic term that the Cuban government used to name the crisis that started after the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the sea became a constant figure for many Cuban artists, contrasting with the previous representations of the sea in the history of the Cuban art. And I didn't want to put like images of that just to constrain the time of my presentation, but I can mention the luminous marinas of Leopoldo Romañas, or even the abstract representations of the sea of Luis Martinez Pedro, or the enigmatic atmosphere of the landscapes of the sea, particularly of Julio Larraz. Contrasting with all that, the sea in the 90s, for this particular generation that was working in the late 80s and early 90s, became a symbol of the most tangible border between day-to-day basic needs and the urgency to overcome that reality, to escape from that reality. Manuel Piña, that's the picture the work we are seeing here, created one of the most iconic images in the history of Cuban art, Aguas Baldias, between 1992 and 94, a series of 11 black and white photographs. We had 2 in the collections, and they were part of this chapter, representing the Havana's Malecon as the materialization of the island's border. As in a visual synecdoche, the city and all that implies its history, its particular architecture, was left out of the composition, while this protagonist or the subject that is depicted in the photo looks beyond the seawall to the unknown, where he projects his dreams of a possible journey to the other side of the horizon, means to better possibilities, to the possibility of a future outside the island. Between the end of the 1980s and the first years of the 1990s, many artists share that common anxiety about looking for ways to leave the island. The special period coincides with a crisis also in Cuban art system, triggered by the resurgence of censorship and the implementation of harsh cultural policies that led to the closing of several art exhibitions in those days. Therefore, many of the protagonists of the so-called new Cuban art left the island, and they based in Mexico, where some of them settled, while others continue on to New York or Miami, principally. In Imitación de Vuelo by Jose Bedia, I think Bedia captures that anxiety with this character that has his hands in the air, trying to imitate the fly of birds, and his feet on the ground, attached to the Cuban soil, to the history of the country. And he captures, in this particular painting, at least 2 crucial dilemmas for artists in the 80s. How can we leave the island? And also, how can we find a legitimate space for the outside Cuba for a movement whose origins were very related to the history of the nation in its sense. On the island, also after this almost relative massive exodus of the generation of the 80s, the issue of anxiety and of migration, exile, continued to be addressed by a younger generation of artists. Most of them were still students by then, who ascended the art scene after the exodus of their predecessors between 1989 and 1983. Barroso, we're seeing here Abel Barroso, Sandra Ramos, and Cacho, and are part of that generation, which consecrated the notion of travel as a recurrent subject. This topic generated a multiplicity of symbols that have become very familiar when we see or talk about Cuban art. Let's say the vista of Havana's Malecon, the sea itself, the shape of the island, the roof, the oars, the suitcase, and so on. But I think that, however, that has become very recurrent in the iconography of Cuban art. The production of at least the last 2 decades, it's been expanding and updating, refreshing those tropos to add other symbols that at the same time are adding nuances to the issues of exile and migration, and also comment on very current realities. For example, in Capote's work, the use of the fish hooks, and previously in the work of Abel Barroso, which is a more recent work than it was not made in the 90s, the symbol of the impenetrable jail as well, represents or recreates the reality of an artist who lives in the island. Particularly in this place, in island seascapes, this is a piece that reenacts the anxiety of an Icelander before the overwhelming presence of the sea and the countless stories of tragedy and death associated with the crossing of the Strait of Florida. But at the same time, kind of in a double metaphor, the use of the hooks could suggest also the need and the struggle to navigate the waters of the international market as well. And of course, the luck to catch a good prey. It's a piece that it's recreating and it's including other symbols, and particularly this artist. I think the hooks and also the surgical scissors that we see in his other piece, included in the show, are refreshing the panorama of symbols when we talk about exile and we talk about immigration in general in contemporary Cuban art. These are all another two pictures of I wanted to show a detail of the piece for those that haven't seen the show, and also a picture of the work in progress as well in the studio of the artist. Curators and art critics Iván de la Nuez and Antonio Eligio Fernandez, who is an artist himself, has explained the correlation between local history and global horizons in the context of Cuban art, particularly for the generations from the 2000s on. They talk about artists who, despite their permanent place of residence, they keep contact with the island. And that is something that has become like very common. Iván de la Nuez in the essay, Tomorrow Was Another Day, he named this generation or generations what he calls the Creole millennial. It's a generation whose consciousness and whose experiences and references have been shaped in the 21st century, and therefore their connection with the revolution is different and it's more oblique, and also the rhetoric or the rhetoric of the epic moments of the revolution sounds like ancient history for them as well. This generation is somehow changing the traditional binomial of inside, outside the island as the only way to approach Cuban art. And it is a group of artists who manage to operate, survive, and also succeed between or despite the dilemmas of their homeland and the global culture. It is probably this particular or this special status what allowed Capote to put in perspective the conflicting opinions that arose after the 2014 announcement of the process of normalizing diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States. In this piece, Aperture, the two surgical scissors made resembling the shape of the Florida Peninsula and the eastern side of Cuba remind us of the remarkable political differences that still exist between these countries, and also of the existence of a deep wound, the healing of which is very, very painful for both sides. Thinking about the present of Cuba, both in a personal and social way, has always been important for artists, and sometimes this has involved to look at the past, as in the work of Sandra Ramos or Jose Angel Toirac or other artists, to look for patterns that explains the present. Sometimes this kind of archaeological process has also been informed by literature and language, as is the case of Manuel Piña and Rogelio López Marín, Gori, who was one of the artists that was included in this show, or an artist who has lived in Miami for a long period of time already. Gori was one of the first Cuban artists to start using photo collage as an aesthetic and conceptual resource, using the leitmotif of the swimming pool as a symbol of the obstacles that must be overcome to reach the other side, whatever those obstacles are, whatever the other side is. It could be ambitions, goals, life projects. Gori challenges our perception between, our differentiation between dream and reality. And those quotes, he uses quotes extracted from the book The Mirror in the Mirror, and I think I put up several quotes because the words, unfortunately, this picture that I'm showing here is just a picture of the work, but the work, in the work, he is handwritten these quotes that he extracted from the book The Mirror in the Mirror by German writer Michael Ende. And these are some of the texts he uses, and those quotes, it serves kind of narrative keys to understand a drama that's happening in the artist's mind, a drama that moves between the impulse to to escape from the immediate circumstances, the impossibility to reach the other side, and also the unpleasant feeling of being simultaneously trapped in a dream, but in a reality that is foreign, where you feel never completely welcome. So it's a very complex piece and very interesting as well. You get from the quotes like the narrative keys to get into this piece. And it was a shared anxiety as well. Many other artists were in the same tone during those days. For Enrique Martinez Elias, as well as for Diego Hernandez, literature and language has been an auxiliary source as well. In the work of Diego Hernandez, literature is subordinated to his interest to create a sensitivity that can only be captured through the syntaxis of painting. In his particular case, and these paintings that he called translated paintings, I think, he pursues a sort of universal language based in the transformation of personal stories, memories, and tangible places into abstract sensations. The sea, the tropical colors that you can identify here in this piece, the oblique lines that recall probably the sea waves or the coral shapes, transfigure something very specific, in this case, the species of Ernesto Che Guevara, into something that is timeless, into an image that is timeless. As I think that also as an immigrant, living in Europe, the conciliation between this process of taking the local, the particular, and turn it into something that is universal, it can also relate to a personal process of conciliate his origins with his current place in the world as well. I wanted to show you other pieces that in this particular direction also talk about the struggle of finding and sometimes defending a place in the world. And that is a sense or a feeling that is shared by Cuban artists, whether living on the island or abroad. And the experiences, of course, is nuanced in both sides of the horizon. In the context of this show, Padilla, Larraz, and Antonia Wright represent different stages of this drama across the diaspora, while the little Cuban in Padilla's Estupor del Cubanito en Territorio Ajeno is facing his fear with boldness, is facing his fear of the unknown. The portrait of Larraz's family is depicting a second generation of Cuban Americans participating actively of the new festivities and traditions of their new context. Meanwhile, the video, Antonia Wright's video, suggests that visibility is more unintentional than a spontaneous process. The water of her Miami-like pool is not the place of redemption that we see in the water used by Juan Carlos Alom, for example. In her case, this water is more like a trap. It feels more like a trap, where this Miami native artist tests somehow her ability to live under or beyond the superficial, to survive under the water, to survive in a place that is not easy to navigate, and she tests her ability to live under that and beyond that superficial context. In the context also of the island, the negotiation of space continues to be important. And I wanted to talk about these two particular artists, Jose, or this collective group, Jorge and Larry and Elizabeth Savino. And this negotiation of space continues to be also important. And more than one single trend we find in the island, like plurality of approaches, some of them very personal, to think about the role of artists and on art and society in general. Many artists, it's true that many Cuban artists have decided to explore Cuban society from a more documentary and anthropological perspective, but there are other artists whose link with reality is more oblique, artists who are devoted to the sophisticated intellectualism of an exotic literature ranging from Eastern philosophies to perestroika. The other piece that this piece that by Jorge and Larry is informed by that sort of exoticism in a pop art version, because they used a lot of reference from pop art, adapted in this case to Cuban reality. They put dialogues between Soviet writers that shares the composition with other celebrities, ranging from political figures to porn stars. And it's a piece that somehow envisions the open, but at the same time, still fragmented visual culture of a country that is supposedly undergoing a process of opening and transformation. On its side, the attention given to Eastern philosophies could represent a more elusive form of exoticism, and Savino's participates in this influence, although in her case, her connection with the interest in nature or the concepts like no representation, empty space, and all that could be also, comes to her also from her connection with the Cuban countryside in her homeland of Manzanillo in the Granma province in Cuba. Elizabeth Savino, and those two pieces that were part of the show, turns landscape, emphasizes contemplation over mimesis, and somehow she turns landscape painting into a more abstraction and performative practice. Horizonte, for example, embraces the viewer besides the need of any figurative element, but even in the cases when she uses the rhetorical figures of poetry, like it was the case in Tierra Muerta, the resulting installation becomes more an abstraction that demands more to be contemplated than reading. Notwithstanding her particularity between the Cuban context, her opera is not an isolated case, because I think her interest is like the systematic interest in performance, and the use of the body connects her work with other artists, like the early works of Tania Bruguera, and also with the works of Ana Mendieta as well. Particularly the interest in nature also creates dialogues between her and the works of Teresita Fernandez. I think that this landscape still preserves the grandiloquence somehow, or it's not the exact word I want to use, the sublimity of the romantic landscape, but they are changing this genre from something that is connected only to the physical reality, to geography, to a genre that can also relate to the psychogeography, that can bring comments on contemporary realities, that can be a place for metaphor to talk about current issues. Also, I think that Tomás Esson comes into that conversation because he uses landscape he takes landscape from a place to recreate the surroundings, to a place to free repressions, and to talk about the force of the body and the beauty of the body, both in the physical realm as well as in the psychological realm. And this particular piece that was part of the show is it's a proof of that, this large-scale landscape painting, that he moved landscape from contemplation to sexuality, to a genre that praised the psychological and physical dimensions of the being. Almost just to close my presentation, I wanted to mention that affinity to nature, or affinity for nature, has a long tradition in the history of art and Cuban culture in general, due in part to the impact of the African diaspora in the formation of the national culture. And this sympathy has become a part of the popular imagination, in which Catholic saints and orishas, or the Santeria deities, merge as the result of transculturation. Madiba has worked extensively in those topics since late 1960s, recreating a spiritual realm inhabited by energies of nature and their intervention in the human realm, being the body the place for that interaction. In general, in internal landscapes, the body and its relationships with the horizon is a unifying element. The body becomes, and I kind of wanted to summarize the ideas that I see, how the body connects one work with the other. The body becomes a vehicle to escape in the work of Gori and Piña, also a site for resistance and political suffering in the works of Bedia or Tania Bruguera or Capote. It also turns into a place to explore spirituality for Mendive or to inquire about nature in Cerviños or Teresita Fernandez, or it takes an spectral appearance in Sandra Ramos' self-portrait as a girl to talk about the contradictions between socialist indoctrination and reality. The body also metamorphoses itself to be part of the nature in the expressionist style of Fabelo, or in the works of Enrique Martinez Elaya, or in the anthropomorphic landscape of Esson, whether it is present or inferior or even absent in the works. I think the body becomes that narrative horizon for stories that are at once personal, but also very are universal. And last thing I wanted to highlight is that this show and at PAM is taking is seeing to Cuban art in a different way. It's breaking that dichotomy of talk about Cuban art only in terms of whatever is produced inside the island or what is outside the island. And it's creating dialogues between artists besides their place of birth or their place of residence. And although this is not a completely new perspective, because it has very other projects that we can mention and exhibitions, since the works that have done Nina Menocal in Mexico, or more recently the project Dialogues in Cuban Art curated by Elizabeth Cerejido. I'm sorry, it's very promising and coherent that this show takes part in Miami, because I think that it opens up, it broadens the comprehension about the recent path that Cuban art is taking. And also from that perspective, I see the horizon no more as a border, no more as a constraint point, but as a transitional liminal space on which we can all envision the future. Thank you.
I'd like to echo my colleague in thanking you, Tobias, for the invitation, and thanking all of you for being here on this beautiful afternoon. So I was asked to speak a little bit about Chapter 2, Abstracting History, and I'm going to focus the first half on a particular Cuban artist who's represented in the show, and then shift to look at sort of the breadth of the collection, thinking about a history of abstraction in Cuba. Abstraction seems to be everywhere today in contemporary Cuban art, sometimes developing out of careers based in design, sometimes arrived at from conceptualism. Abstraction is a favored language by a new generation of artists who use it to address a range of concerns, aesthetic, conceptual, even political. While this is a global trend, Cuba has its own specific history of abstraction, one that frames the recent additions to the PAM collection. I'll focus on paths through Cuban abstraction running from the 1940s to the present. So I'd like to begin with Sandu Darier's untitled mid-century painting included in Chapter 2, Abstracting History. Darier was one of the earliest practitioners of abstract art in Cuba. Born in Romania in 1908, he emigrated in 1941 to Cuba and died in 1991. He was co-editor of the seminal art journal Noticias de Arte in the 1950s, years in which he also befriended Spanish Republicans in exile, as well as Wilfredo Lam and Dolores Lolo Soldevilla, as well as other artists, many Cuban artists who had been in Paris and were returning in the 50s. Like others working in geometric abstraction in Argentina, Brazil, or Venezuela, other countries known for the trend in geometric abstraction, Dardier undertook constructivist studies of pictorial structures. Like his peers, he eventually abandoned painting's support and he moved into sculpture, video, kinetic art. Yet Dardier, who in 1951 showed at the Rose Fried Gallery in New York alongside Pierre Mondrian, Jean Arp, Ellis, and other figures from a historic European avant-garde, has only recently begun to receive attention outside of Cuba, or serious attention. On the island, he's also undergoing a kind of rediscovery by artists and critics inspired by his innovative career that moved from abstraction into kinetic and then socially engaged art, and always concerned with color, form, movement, and light. This past winter, for instance, the Cuban new media artist Yonlai Cabrera Quindemil exhibited a series in Havana, followed by a symposium like this on Dardier, and the series, titled Diagrams 2017, sought to use computer modeling to update Dardier's research into pictorial structures. But what Yonlai Cabrera did was he used these structures to sort of transfigure issues in contemporary Cuban society. And so participants in the show were asked to sort of do some kind of exercises with these algorithmically produced images to try to solve some of the issues in contemporary Cuban society. A spate of recent shows in New York, Miami, there's a recent show that has a significant component of Dardier's work, and elsewhere have also featured Dardier and other key members of Cuba's mid-century abstract movements. A new generation finds in abstraction relevant tools for reflecting on both form and social analysis in a data-driven society. So you can see that here with Yonlai Cabrera. You can also see it in the work of Kenya Arguiñao's Collapse of a Region Without Dimension or Time, which, like Cabrera's algorithmic modeling, similarly creates mathematical or even computational forms that may be apprehended both as geometry and as enigmatic renderings of contemporary society, just hinted at in the titles. In fact, the history of Cuban abstraction more generally is sort of undergoing a bit of a renaissance or renewed attention, thanks to important exhibitions and monographs. For too long, received wisdom held that Cuban abstraction was tainted on the island by its association with pre-revolutionary society. But the truth is more complicated. Most agree that a 1963 exhibition, Expresionismo Abstracto, signaled the end of abstraction's brief dominance. So it was sort of dominant in the late 50s in the island and then was displaced by other trends, pop art, hyperrealism, and then the 1980s new Cuban art. But some artists did continue to make abstract art, even in Cuba, for decades. And some of those people who continued to make it were members of the founding groups, the 11 Los Once, artists of a gestural abstraction who worked between 1953 and 55, or the 10 concrete artists who worked between about 1958 to 1961. When Dolores Loloso de Villa returned to Cuba from Paris in 1956, she brought with her works of geometric abstraction, op art, and kinetic art, mobile art. She was instrumental in moving abstraction in Cuba beyond its expressionist moment and into concrete art. In bold paintings and sculptures, the 10 concrete painters embraced geometric abstraction as a universal democratic language. In parallel with these Havana-based groups, other Cuban-born artists soon developed careers in New York, Madrid, and San Juan, Puerto Rico. Jose Angel Rosabal, at one point a member of the 10 concrete artists, moved in 1968 to New York, where he was joining Carmen Herrera and arriving in 1964 for a few years, Ilya Sanchez, who then moved on to Puerto Rico. Waldo Ballart moved to New York from Cuba in 1960 and then on to Madrid in 1972. And these are all artists who are represented in the recent collection who are working sort of alongside the Cuba-based abstract artists. While Ballart, Rosabal, and Herrera continued to practice a kind of hard-edged abstraction, Sanchez's two pieces included in Abstracting History are exemplary of her erotic topologies, works that straddled painting, relief, sculpture, swollen and crisp, with intimations of breasts, buttocks, nipples, and other protrusions rising and recessing. While Sanchez, who by the 1970s had settled in San Juan, employs a mathematical or cartographic vocabulary, topologies, she distances herself from her peers' harder shapes that you saw in the preceding slides. These diasporic artists' ongoing exploration of abstraction throughout the 1970s, and indeed up to the present, was matched by comparable interest by their Cuba-based peers. But abstraction in Cuba evolved in the post-1959 period in ways both consonant with and divergent from trends elsewhere. Soldevilla, Dardier, and Salvador Coraje used constructivist language to describe and intervene into a historical moment. For them, abstraction was not, as has often been suggested, a US-promoted Batista-aligned program. That was one of the charges against some of the artists in the 1950s, but in fact furthered European new plasticists, Russian avant-garde, or Bauhaus programs for thinking, form, and society. Dardier's post-1959 career elucidates some of the ways that abstraction in Cuba hewed to this inheritance of European vanguard innovation, while also embracing, to varying degrees, the aesthetic and political programs linked to the revolution. Like other European exiles, and in fact other Cubans who were returning to the island, Dardier proclaimed himself dazzled by the Caribbean light and landscape. Instead of fomenting a folkloric tropicalism, however, the natural world's geometries inspired Dardier's turn to abstract art. This Romanian-born painter saw in plant leaves both design and dynamism, factors that would then lead him to work in kinetic art. So he saw that the way that nature suffered change from sunlight and rain and kind of developed new forms should be a model for his own art. In the 1950s, he began making his transformable structures, which were designed to be manipulated. Born of his interest in color and change, they also led, sort of by accident, to his 1964 moving video poem, which is one of the first video works from Latin America of its kind, called Cosmorama. And it's a little bit similar to work made by the Brazilian artist in the late 1940s, Abraham Palachnicky, who had done these works, also kinetic work where light and color moved around. Dardier's Cosmorama, or spatial poem number 1, was also a kind of machine that he invented that was supposed to project color and movement, and again emphasize the role of change in art. And if in the 50s Dardier had been showing with these kind of leading European modernist artists, by the early 60s he was trying to think about his work in connection with what was happening on the island and globally in terms of kind of new trends in making art with poor materials. So if you think about the kind of Italian arte povera or the Cuban filmmaker Garcia Espinosa's notion of imperfect cinema, or the Brazilian director Glauber Rocha's aesthetics of hunger, these were all people trying to make art with sort of poor materials. Dardier argued he was making poor kinetic art, so using very simple materials to invent these mobile sculptures. He also saw this as a pedagogical tool, and this is again very much in line with the early 60s revolutionary programs of, for example, bringing film, mobile cinema to the countryside. He thought of Cosmorama as a mobile museum. But at other times, he kind of moved away from this very top-down pedagogical instruct the masses approach and tried to invent or recognize in Cuban popular culture codes for creating new works. So he collaborated on some dance programs. He did the design and costumes for an Afro-Cuban music and dance program. And he also proposed a giant collaborative project of stitching together a quilt that neighborhood women would collectively produce that was supposed to either cover the steps of the University of Havana or cover some major streets in downtown Havana. And this, I don't think that the quilt was ever made, but I think now moving towards the sort of the afterlives of Dardier's innovations, some of its echoes can be seen, for example, in the recent work by Amy Garcia for the 2012 Havana Biennial Purity, Pureza, which was a huge piece of cloth collectively crocheted, collectively and continually crocheted. And this kind of interest by Amy Garcia in bringing what have often been gendered or domestic artistic projects into a larger, even abstract scale, echoes in her work that's included in the collection from 2014, which carefully stitches gold, blue, and white thread over lines from collaged official newsprint. This piece dances between figuration and abstraction as the threads turn the tabloid into blocks of angled lines and colors. So both permitting and inviting the viewer to read it, but also standing in the way of deciphering the language. So the newspaper's words, like the threads covering them, reveal and obfuscate, announce meaning and suppress it. So while this mid-century, early 1950s and 60s abstraction has been a source of inspiration for artists working today, I think there's a significant change, and that is namely that the mid-century movement saw abstraction as this democratic universal language that sort of needed no translation or even necessarily meaning. Contemporary artists tend to be using the vocabulary of abstraction to actually say something conceptual or political in many cases. So Jose Angel Vincence's Worm #1 or Exile #5 abstract into elegant gold shapes the letters of the once charged, painful words gusano and exilio, terms used to alternately denigrate some Cubans as counter-revolutionary or to claim a political status that more recent generations of emigres largely don't claim. The gold plating of the words and the evocation of mid-century abstract sculpture might suggest that the harsh discourse of the 1970s has been repackaged, like so much revolutionary branding, as a luxury export. But the pieces might equally be interested in smuggling into the vocabulary of Latin American abstraction the reminder of prior political, affective, and familial struggles. Perhaps more than any other Cuban artist working today, Reiner Levanovo consistently translates research into Cuban and world history into minimalist surfaces, and he named a recent installation of his in Cuba, Revolution is an Abstraction. His 9 laws from the series The Weight of History process an algorithm he's developed with programmers to determine the amount of ink used to print 9 important laws established by the revolutionary government. With the same ink, he then paints these rectangles of varying proportions. A tweaking of the black monochrome, the Malevich black square, returns in Eduardo Ponjuan's enigmatic Polaroid from 2014, which meditates on both transformations of media and the vicissitudes of history. Although the artist claimed that this black empty frame registered his mother's passing as he was making the painting, the image of a black Polaroid remains semantically open. Is the photo underexposed? Is it about to reveal a telling image? Or is it a commentary on sort of aging technologies that then get brought back? So the Polaroid sort of famously died and has been resuscitated as a contemporary kind of almost nostalgic medium. Neither citing earlier abstraction nor using its vocabulary as a cipher for history, Elizabeth Cerviño, whom we looked at earlier, frequently fuses landscape and language, but she shears these genres of any easy meaning by removing form. So landscape lurks at the limit of figuration and abstraction in Horizons, and in Kiss in Dead Land, she installed on the gallery floor these irregularly shaped ceramic crests that unspool like a script from an unknown language. The objects recall fragments of ways, but what they are is the bottom half of words of a poem that she wrote about the natural world, and the top half has been excised. So it's actually language, but appearing as nature. And Arguiñao's #6, intricate filigree drawings tangled into a mass of delicate ink, resonate visually with works by Havana-based artists Ariadna Contino and Alex Hernandez. And that duo series, Aesthetic Militancy, includes a white-on-white diptych of concentric circles. The work might appear to be concerned with form, line, and paper, but in fact, it's a visual translation of abstract measurements driving the global economy. So one of the works in this series is called Production of Crude Oil in 2012, and they translate all those mathematical sums into visual representations. Contino and Hernandez, like Levanovo, thus present research into global realities via abstract images. The gesture is part of a global boom in abstraction that's been read by some as a sort of ironically mimetic, because abstraction is supposed to not represent something, but here these works end up sort of, in a way, representing the abstraction of contemporary capitalism, or that's been how they've been read. Yet art historian Brioni Fair is more precise, arguing that abstraction's 21st afterlife, or the recent boom in abstraction globally, owes to the fact that abstraction allows itself to be adapted to local contexts. So abstraction in Cuba registers these two impulses, I think. A desire for the universal formal language of the 1950s and 60s, and a kind of use or a channeling of that language towards first nationalist or revolutionary and now post-revolutionary socially engaged projects. Cuban abstraction continues to refer to both national specificities and international trends and histories, histories that are themselves shaped by the world historical role that the Caribbean island has exercised for centuries.
Thank you.
Thank you to Tobias for the kind invitation to participate in this project, as well to Anita and Maritza, who worked with us on these papers, and my colleagues in the panel, Anelys and Rachel. So the first thing I have to say is that I'm not an art critic. I am an anthropologist by training, as you heard in Tobias' presentation. So I don't look at the third chapter, Domestic Anxieties, from an art historian's perspective, but from the perspective of someone who has been studying the Cuban exodus for more than 30 years. And since I moved to Miami 6 years ago, I've been trying to figure out exactly what the cultural politics of the Cuban American community are, and particularly because of my job at FIU, working with art exhibits at the Frost Art Museum, book presentations, concerts, and other cultural practices. I've been trying to see exactly what fits into the community, what doesn't fit into the community. And I think this particular chapter, chapter 3, raises some of those issues as to where are the limits of Cuban American tolerance for art produced in Cuba, how much the Cuban American community has changed over the past 30 years or so. And I think I begin with this image from Luis Cruz Azaceta, which pretty much summarizes, I think, most of what I have to say, which is, and I play around with the phrase domestic anxiety that Tobias came up with, not to talk so much about the paintings themselves, but what kinds of responses and reactions the exhibiting and the display and the buying and selling of Cuban art produced in Cuba after '59 creates in this community. So that's what the domestic anxieties I'm thinking of in this presentation. So let me just give you briefly what I try to do in the paper. I try to review very quickly. I can't go into details into Cuba's cultural policies since 1959, basically because it gives, I think, some historical background as to why the divisions between artists living in Cuba and artists living in exile or in the diaspora are still creating and being the object of debate. So I'll just try to summarize that section very quickly. Then I want to focus on the Cuban American community, the diaspora. I'm using diaspora and exile almost as synonyms, although I'm very well aware that those two terms mean different things to different people. But I believe that diaspora is a broader term that would include exiles, particularly those who came in the 1960s and 70s, the so-called historical exiles. But then in comparison with the more recent exiles, including artists that have been described before, many, oftentimes they don't see themselves as exiles, but as immigrants and as part of this global dispersion of Cubans around the world. And then, again, from my anthropological perspective, I think it's important to take into account what has happened in the last 60 years within the Cuban American community, and by extension also diaspora communities in Mexico, in Puerto Rico, in Spain, and wherever a large number of Cubans live, because I do think because of the changing demographic and socioeconomic composition, then the responses to, again, these questions of art and culture vary from one generation to another, one wave to another, and I'll give you some examples of that. And finally, of course, given the fact that Cuban art and Cuban American art, and more generally US artists, have been isolated for so long since the beginning of the revolution, concretely since the imposition of the trade embargo, and the recent short-lived opening under the Obama administration in the second half of his administration, there have been some changes in US-Cuba relations that have made a strong impact on the field of culture, particularly the multiplication of art exhibits, of musical events, of cultural exchanges, visits in both directions, and so on, that have really changed the climate, I think, not only in the US, but particularly in Miami. So that's sort of the plan, and I hope that I can cover this in the 20 minutes that I have. I want to begin with a very concrete reference to this painting, which unfortunately has been lost. This is the burned painting by Manuel Madiba in 1988 that I make reference to in the title. It must have been a very typical painting by Madiba because it included some of his well-known symbols drawn from Afro-Cuban religion. This seems to be the image of Ochun, Pavo Real in Spanish, and the reason why I begin with this painting is, I think, because it's a very concrete and dramatic example of what's going on around the time. In 1988, as many of you know, there was an auction, an art auction at the now defunct Museum of Cuban Art and Culture here in Miami, in which this painting was auctioned and created a very difficult situation for many of the members of the board who actually resigned the month later. But what I want to make reference to is particularly that this painting was bought for $500 by one member of the audience who was a participant in the 2506 Brigade, Brigada de Bahía de Cochinos, and when he got the painting, he proceeded to burn it outside the street in front of a small group of Cuban exiles who were protesting precisely that Madiba and some other Cuban artists who were still living in Cuba were part of that auction. So this is the beginning, I think, of the tale I want to tell, and just to have a better idea of what the painting must have looked like, with similar images of Ochun in the painting, and as you know, Madiba, and I think Anelys already mentioned that, it has been developing these themes over and over again, and perhaps this is what the original painting would have looked like. So let me go back then to the historical part for the moment. I'll come back to the issue of the burnt painting in a moment. But I think it's necessary to, in order to understand the very strong political and emotional reactions that such a painting, which really by today's standards is quite innocent and not political at all, but in fact, the people who were opposed to this auction mentioned that any artist coming from Cuba would be considered a communist, and that was enough for the Cuban exile community at the time to reject it. So where does that strong political division between Cubans on the island and here begin? I think it goes back in the artistic field to the infamous words by Fidel Castro in 1961, the words of the intellectuals, where he, a very long speech, of course, like all of Fidel's long-winded speeches, he said those terrible words that still resonate today. Dentro de la revolución todo, contra la revolución nada. Within the revolution everything, against the revolution nothing. And even though there have been moments in which those words have been interpreted in different ways, I think they really set the parameters for the rest of the cultural policies of the Cuban Revolution. And many artists remaining on the island had to struggle with the difference between being inside and being outside, and when exactly you became a counter-revolutionary artist was, of course, a critical moment in many of the careers of artists, but as well writers and other intellectuals. At the same time, or shortly thereafter, the United States decided to impose a trade embargo. He is President Kennedy signing the total embargo, which had been already started by President Eisenhower the year before. And since that moment, I think really for at least 2 decades, there was practically no contact between Cuban artists, or for that matter, Cubans in the US and Cubans on the island until about 1978, which, as you know, began a process of the so-called diálogo, and Cubans were able to return to Cuba, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I think this is the beginning, the early 1960s, of a very difficult, tense relationship in which practically no contact was kept between Cubans here and Cubans on the island. It had to do with the practical isolation of Cuba for all kinds of purposes, but particularly for cultural and artistic purposes. So I wanted to focus on a couple of examples of what was going on in Cuba at the time. This is a very famous and interesting painting by Antonia Iris, a tribune for democratic peace, which actually apparently got her into trouble. One of the sort of ironic commentaries, you may interpret this the way you want. It certainly, to my mind, evokes some of Fidel's, again, speeches in the Plaza de la Revolución, the very strange-looking, sort of ghost-like creatures looking at this empty podium from the perspective of the person who would have given the speech. And then there are intriguing posters there or signs with PCV, not PCC, meaning Cuban Communist Party. Who knows whether the V refers to something else? Who knows? But in any case, this painting, I think, is very much representative of the limits to which Cuban artists living in Cuba could go to. And of course, eventually, Iris moved to Miami and died in exile. Another option would have been this one, which again is a very iconic representation of Cuba in 1970 by Raúl Martínez, who, by the way, was one of the artists, along with Madiba, who participated in the auction in Little Havana in 1968. And if you've seen this image, you recognize some of the well-known figures from Fidel Castro to Camilo Cienfuegos, and there's, of course, in the center, that a symbol of the Comités de Defensa de Revolución, the Committees of the Defense of the Revolution. I believe this was the 10th anniversary of that much hated political institution on the island. And the colors and the figures, and of course, compared to Iris's sort of dark and gray, pessimistic, ironic perspective, this would have been probably more accepted. And of course, if you look into Raúl Martínez's work himself, who was one of the original abstract artists in the 1950s, but that turned to this more figurative, more celebratory kind of art, that was, of course, promoted by the state. So since I'm going very quickly, I want to say that during the 1960s, of course, there were all kinds of debates about what kind of art, what kind of culture the Cuban Revolution would support. There was never really a very serious attempt to impose a Soviet-style socialist realism, as far as I can tell. But there were, of course, very significant moments, such as the so-called Padilla Affair, 1971, in which the well-known poet, Alberto Padilla, was detained and was forced to confess publicly his so-called counter-revolutionary sins. And that, of course, I think ended a whole period of time, the honeymoon, if you will, between sectors of the intellectual intelligentsia around the world, especially in Latin America, people like Mario Vargas Llosa and others who protested against the mistreatment of intellectuals, in particular for Padilla. And since then, I think there has been a more critical reaction between the global left and particularly writers and artists interested in Cuban culture. Immediately after that, and again, I'm going very quickly, but there was another moment which many people in Cuba remember today as the worst period of time, the 1971 to 76 period, the so-called Quinquenio Gris, or the 5 gray years. This is one representation by a contemporary artist of what that period would have looked like, and I think it's called precisely Quinquenio Gris. And I believe most contemporary artists and writers who lived through that period don't want to go back at all. And even when the person who was in charge of this period in the cultural affairs sphere was brought back from his retirement, there was a tremendous negative reaction, the so-called Guerrita de los Emails, the war of the emails, in which most members of the Union of Writers and artists protested against this sort of return to a more repressive moment in Cuban cultural policy. We've already heard about the special period, so I'm just gonna summarize a couple of points here. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly where I took this picture from, but I do know it's in the 1990s. It's some kind of installation that, again, draws back to the idea of the sea. It very specifically refers to the rafter crisis, the Balsero crisis in the 1990s, and all of the symbols, the fish and the and the boats and the oars that were already mentioned. And I think for the purposes of my presentation, what I think is important to remember is that the special period really opened up opportunities for artists and writers, musicians also, to engage in commercial transactions for the first time in many years as a number of gallery owners, museum directors, editors, and really a lot of cultural entrepreneurs in a way invaded Cuba to see what was there and how they could profit from this boom in not only in visual arts but also in literature and music particularly. Now, at the same time in Miami, this is a picture of a very young Ramon Cernuda that I found online, and I believe that is the old Cuban Museum. Of course, Cernuda had been the one in charge of the auction, and he was very much a part of the discussion that went on for a long time. And then shortly thereafter, his own private collection was confiscated by the U.S. government. He sued the government in this case, which I think is a landmark case with regard to our topic today, the so-called the exhibit and buying of Cuban art in the U.S. And he won the case in Cernuda versus Hivi. He claimed that the art that he had that he was collecting and showing in his gallery was exempt from the embargo, and the U.S. Supreme Court gave him approved his lawsuit. So I think since then, since 1989, is where you begin to see, even though the embargo was still in place, you begin to see more and more exhibits, more and more interest, more and more connection between Cuban and Cuban American artists. For instance, in 1993, you find this very important exhibit of Cuban artists in the 20th century, which I believe is still, I mean, the exhibit is not on display right now, but they do have a collection, and that in a way, I think, represented this resurgence of U.S. interest in contemporary Cuban art, and particularly modern art of the avant-garde, which is represented here by the catalog cover. Now, jumping to the more recent past, I want to stop for a moment on this moment in December 17, 2014, or D17 as it was called then, a very brief moment before the current administration, in which the possibility of so-called normalizing U.S.-Cuba relations, again, in particular led to a number of cultural initiatives, the sheer number and diversity of exhibits in the United States, including artists from Cuba, the smaller number, I would say, of intellectuals, writers, musicians who would travel to Cuba as well, seems phenomenal. And I think this is a particular stage in U.S.-Cuba relations, particularly in the cultural field, that is very significant and still has all kinds of significant repercussions, which I hope to describe briefly. This is an image of, I think, what was the most publicized episode in the Obama administration's opening to Cuba, in which members of his presidential committee for the arts and the humanities traveled to Cuba, and as you can see in the image, had very direct contacts with musicians, artists, and so on. And then if you actually look at the announcements that they made, they proclaimed that they would initiate a number of architectural preservation programs, scholarship programs for Cubans who wanted to come to the United States and then go back to the island, and others that unfortunately many of them were not realized later on. At the same time, more or less at the same time, the Smithsonian Institution announced that it was going to plan the summer festival, folk festival, devoted to Cuba, and they had very advanced plans to do that, but at the last minute they canceled that event because they couldn't agree with the Cuban government. However, as some of you may know, the largest single cultural event, I think, dealing with Cuba is coming up now in May. The JFK Center has planned a 2-week event. You may recognize Aimenu Viola on the left, so it includes some members of the Cuban American community, others who are not as well known, so it's a musical, dance, arts, and culture, as well as film event that I think is going to be an important part of this cycle. Again, this is just the sort of the last of the many that I actually mentioned in my paper. Now, the question of how Cuban exiles and Cuban Americans in general have responded, have been part of this larger picture, I think, again, it's a sort of an open question. And I begin with the fact, you may recognize the old Moderna Poesia library, a bookstore in Little Havana that unfortunately closed some time ago, along with Ediciones Universal, which were, I think, were anchors, cultural anchors of the community. But I think I use this picture to remind you that when Cubans arrived in Miami in the early 1960s, there was very little interest in Cuban American art and culture. And so in many ways, I think the Cuban American community had to build their own institutions, La Moderna Poesia, the other institutions, including the Cuban Art and Culture Museum that I mentioned before, and of course, other kinds of institutions, educational institutions, schools, and so on, that would promote their own culture, given that there was very little interest on the larger community. I want to just note here that one critic, Lynette Bush, who was recently here in Miami and presented a paper about this topic, she argues, I think convincingly, that the problem in part during the 1960s and 70s was the art that Cubans in exile were producing was not really in sync with the kind of abstract and modern and postmodern agenda of most art institutions here in the US, particularly in New York City. That could change later on, but at least in the beginning, that led to the isolation, the lack of attention to the work that some Cuban American artists were presenting. This is one exception, the so-called Miami generation, and the first instance of this exhibit was held in 1983, which appears to be the first large exhibit of Cuban art produced in the United States. This is, of course, Humberto Calzada, who is still around and is one of the senior members of that generation. And in 2014, there was sort of a meeting of those artists again here in Miami. And after that, you see a number of large initiatives to exhibit the art of Cubans in the United States. And of course, in the more recent decades, there has been a growing acceptance and exhibiting of Cuban art, including Calzada's work. Now, I want to return to the issue of what has been changing in the Cuban American community to allow, in many ways, for the growing acceptance of these cultural exchange programs. And I apologize because these charts don't look exactly the same as I prepared. But I'm drawing on the FIU Cuba poll, which some of you may know has been conducted for more than 30 years, since 1991, and has shown some of the changes that have characterized the Cuban American community here in Miami. And of course, one of the main questions is the embargo. And this is basically what Guillermo Grenier and Hugh Gladwin have been looking at for some time. It begins in 1997 because the question of the embargo was different in the years prior. But as you can see, basically the trend has been that for every year that the poll has been conducted, since 1997, there have been about 10 different polls, the support for the embargo has declined. And declined substantially from about 75% in 1997 to about 48% in the last year, which I think was 2016. Now, you can argue with the exact percentages, you can debate whether the question was asked correctly, but I think the pattern is quite strong and has been supported by other polls, by Nuevo Herald, by Amandi and Ben Dixon, who are experts on public polling and so on. So I think most of the data that we have for this are quite consistent, and they show that something is going on in the Cuban American community with regard to that particular question, but in fact there are others as well. And more interesting perhaps than asking the question about whether people support or not the embargo is, for instance, this question about whether they support reestablishing diplomatic relations, which is exactly what happened right after Obama announced the normalization of relations in 2015 when embassies opened in Havana and Washington. So I'll just show you quickly the three bars. The main difference here in the data suggests that people who arrived before 1980, before the Mariel Exodus, basically opposed, or at least more than half opposed, reestablishing diplomatic relations. But of course, the more recent wave, especially those who came after 1995, after the Balsero crisis, overwhelmingly support reestablishing diplomatic relations. And those in the middle, again, are somewhere in the middle. And if you came in one of these waves, you can sort of look at yourself and see where you stand. So this and other data that I'm not going to show you, I don't want to bore you with the statistical numbers, but they are available, I think suggests that Cubans over time, Cuban Americans, have moved toward greater acceptance of some kind of relationship with Cuba, even though, of course, what kind of relationship is a question. But roughly, I think it has moved slowly but surely from a politics of isolation to some kind of engagement with the island. I want to show this image from the Madiba retrospective. I know Carol Damien is somewhere in the back who organized it, and I think it was a very successful example. And Madiba, by the way, comes up again and again. He comes up in that early period of time in which his painting was burned. He appears and reappears in the current Pérez Museum exhibit. And for me, and I know for many who were present, the fact that Madiba came and participated in this, one of his processions on campus, and it was an academic and cultural event, and nothing happened. Nobody, called to threat, for a bomb threat, and nobody burned any paintings, fortunately. So in a way, we've come a long way from those years. The project that Elizabeth Cerejido organized and also had many of the artists come here to the Pérez Art Museum, I think is another excellent example of some of the changes. And these are, by the way, Cuban artists from the islands who were invited to go to Calle Ocho and look at the murals there and had some significant interaction with the local community. And I believe that is one of the best examples of the so-called dialogues that are going on in the Cuban and Cuban American community. Next to final example that I want to give is what appeared to have been the largest single exhibit here in Miami of Cuban art in the 20th century at the Coral Gables Art Museum. It began in the colonial period, the Spanish colonial period, and then ended in the near past with, as far as I can tell, the most significant number of artists from every period. And again, what I think was interesting about this exhibit is that it included both artists living in Cuba after 1959, as well as a few artists who have moved to the United States. And then finally, of course, this exhibit here, which has brought us together today, and I go back to the Luis Cruz Azaceta painting, which is part of this wonderful display of various kinds of works of art dealing with the issue of migration. And as has been said before, this topic has become one of the recurrent themes in Cuban and Cuban American art. It's interpreted in different ways and presented by various artists, both on the island and here. What I think is a very productive dialogue and interaction with each other. So to conclude, then, I want to remind you then why, one of the questions that I had in my mind was, why does Cuban art produce such strong political reactions among Cuban exiles and Cuban Americans? And one of the reasons, I think, is because since 1959, and again, referring to that famous word to the intellectuals by Fidel, the state really has become, at least during the first 30 years before the special period, the manager and the owner, frankly, of most creative expression in the visual arts, in literature, in music, and so on. That has changed somewhat since the 1990s especially, but still is very difficult to create and to produce your own art and your own culture if you don't somehow engage with the Cuban government. The other point that I want to emphasize is that since 1959 to about 1989, again, there was very little interaction between Cuban and US-based artists, and that includes as well Cuban-American artists who could not travel to Cuba, could not have regular interaction with the island, and that has begun to change somewhat in the last couple of decades. There has been increasing contact between Cuban and Cuban-American artists, and in fact, it's been increasingly difficult to distinguish between the two. And we were talking earlier about this phenomenon now in the last few years in which some artists have been able to move back and forth between the island and the United States, or to have studios in Spain or in Mexico and move around. So the borders between Cuban and Cuban American art have become more blurred, but in any case, they still exist, and they're very much part of the discussion that brought us to this moment. And finally, I want to end on this topic that has become almost a cliche, but it's certainly an important metaphor, the metaphor of the bridges that connect us but also separate us. And going back to some of the images that were shown before, the idea of the sea and the sea that separates Cubans on this shore, but from that shore, and again, the horizon that divides the two. But in any case, I believe that in the past few years, those bridges across the Florida Straits have become stronger, and hopefully will bring together people from the island and people who are living in the diaspora. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. I mean, very different perspectives and takes on each of the chapters. And I wonder if you have any questions for each other, or I could ask, a few things. But does anything jump out that you want to ask one another? Or we can also open it up now too. But any thoughts? I have a couple questions. Maybe starting with Rachel. You sort of this interest in abstraction, sort of right now. I mean, do you identify, I think there's an interest, a return to sort of looking at Cuban abstraction. Do you see an influence of that coming from more trends recently within Latin American art in general, or could you sort of identify a little bit of that interest or lineage?
Yeah, I think this is actually an example in which the circuits that all of this art is participating in as fully global now make it really hard to distinguish where influences are coming from. I definitely think the renewed attention to Cuban abstraction owes to the kind of last 15 years of boom in interest in geometric abstraction in Latin America more generally. And then people sort of came to realize that Cuba had been left out of these major studies that often included Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil. And then, so the work of the curator who's Havana-based Elsa Vega has been really important. Abigail McEwen, who's US-based art historian, did an important study that came out in 2016 or 2015 on Cuban abstraction. So there's been sort of important scholarly and curatorial work. But I also think if we think about the interest by that young artist, Yonlai Cabrera, in bringing back Dardier on the island, in a way, these artists are seeing the ways that abstraction is circulating globally and themselves becoming newly interested in their own kind of history. So for example, the other concrete painter, Pedro De Orta, who received the Cuban National Art Prize 2 years ago, he's about 86 years old, he continued painting and working. He was one of the original 10 and has been making art for, six decades or something. And he wasn't overlooked, but he wasn't celebrated. And I think, so a growing interest, both on the island, but also coming from this global kind of trend, has been perceived by people who are on the island, but, seeing what's happening everywhere. So it's sort of hard to separate those two.
And Ellis, do you want to talk a little bit, I think it's interesting, and Jorge brought it up, this kind of the greater fluidity between sort of who's working on the island, who's working outside the island, just sort of your experience with certain artists and how they've been received on both sides of that, maybe from the Havana, I don't know.
Yeah, as an intro, I was talking with Rachel before the panel, and it's an interesting scenario because before, let's go back to those people who came in the 60s, or they probably weren't willing to go back to the island because of the political reasons that moved them out of the archipelago itself. But then we see the generations, another move in the 80s with the artists that are based here in Miami or in Mexico or in New York. And that's still a generation that hasn't been like too open to go back to the island. But the artists who came in the early 90s, artists like Glexis Novoa, for example, that we find cases that artists like they open a studio in Havana and they're now moved between the two scenarios with more flexibility. And from the island, it's the same thing. In the 90s, for example, I think that the 90s generation kind of changed that perspective. And it's interesting because Tonel mentions that, and also Ivan de la Nuez. They say that the artists in the 2000s, somehow they learn from the previous generation that although their work must be perceived by the international audience, they has to be, or somehow that perception is always connected to the Cuban space. So the artists in the 90s, they learned somehow that lesson that although they establish place of residency outside the island, they always go back. I'm thinking of Los Carpinteros, for example, or Iber and Garaycoa, or artists that are they are well inserted into the international market, but they'll also maintain a presence in Havana, and they has studios here and there. And now the current generation, we see like people like Joan Capote or Elizabeth Savino, who are not willing to open a space in outside outside Havana, but they move from the island and outside the island with a more fluid path. I mean, it's hard to create like a diagram of cases because I think it goes case by case, but this scenario it's been changing, and now that phenomena that from the island is studied as they call it the retorno, those artists that return to the island, and they, as Glexis, for example, is a great example of that, because Glexis went back, they gave him solo show in the National Museum of Havana, and it's interesting also in terms of his language, because he moved aside, or he put aside for a little bit whatever he was doing to the moment, and he went back to the language he was doing at the time he left Cuba. Mm-hmm. So how those moves are impacting also the artist languages and the issues they are working on is interesting, and it's more, I mean, it has become more fluid. In the case of Cuba, the issue if you are based outside the island or inside the island has always passed through the political filter, because you don't ask the same question for artists from any other country in the world who are based outside their place of birth. But in the case of Cuba, there's always that political filter that's still there if you live inside or outside. But I think it's changing, and at least exhibitions like this are changing the way you see Cuban art as more wide, from a more wide perspective.
Jorge, you talked about, you did a lot of research. This wasn't on the top of your head, a lot of it. What were some of your greatest surprises within the research that you found, or like what was unusual for you,
Well, I think the discovery of that landmark case by Cernuda, I think that really began to change many of the things that we've been talking about. Before Cernuda's lawsuit, it was very difficult to display, to see Cuban art here. There was very little exchange going on. But after that, I think in the 1990s precisely, coinciding with a special period, there was a boom in interest in Cuban art. And not just in the visual arts, but of course this is the period in which you have Buena Vista Social Club, in which you have Strawberry and Chocolate, the film that was nominated for an Oscar, and many other expressions of interest in Cuban culture that remain today, right? And I think that's what sort of stuck my mind, that the 1990s began a slow but certainly very strong process of recovery, if you will, of the connections between Cuban art and the United States that have been lost for 30 years.
I wanted to say something also, because it's in our minds, and we usually, when we talk inside, outside the island, we are kind of thinking Havana and Miami. But this show at the collection and it's a bigger phenomenon, because we're talking about like Diango Hernandez, who's based in Germany, who works with a well-renowned gallery in Germany, and Garaycoa, who's based in Spain. So there's artists who are based like everywhere nowadays. And I also wanted to point out that the exchange between Havana and outside Cuba, and in the particular case of the United States, depends somehow on an infrastructure that allows the artists to come and to visit both, the island and the United States. There was a particular time during the Bush administration where artists like Los Carpinteros or any other Cuban artist, they could not get visas to come to the United States. So this particular moment that we are living in now, besides the personal intentions of the ideas or the best intentions of the artists, collectors, and whoever is working on the arts, to create those bridges is always recalls on the existence of an infrastructure of policies that allows that interchange, particularly in the case of Cuba and the United States.
Which is constantly changing.
Exactly, that's,
Yeah.
I didn't want to go there, but it's just like to leave it at, it depends on that. It has to exist, that infrastructure, those policies that allow people to come and go both sides of the island.
Why don't we open it up to questions? There are a couple of questions. Anita, will you?
Very good. That way I don't have to stand up. I am Olga Connor, and I write articles for El Nuevo Herald, and I have a couple of questions, and one is for Rachel, who was presenting artists that are constructivist or arte concreto, and the question to her, and then I'll ask another question to Duany, is about the fact that Waldo Ballard has complained that his last name has produced a rejection in many places of his art because he shares it with his nephews who are representatives, or one of them was representative, Lincoln Diaz Ballard and Mario Diaz Ballard. And of course, he was doing all of that you were talking about in New York. And yet, Carmen Herrera and all of the other artists are being recognized, and he wasn't recognized as much, even though in Germany he was, but not by the people in the United States and in Cuba. And the other question is for Andrés Duany. If he, when he talked about Madiba, that was very interesting to me because I was there in front of the cameras of TV when he burnt the painting. The man who burnt the painting was the uncle of Manolo Silverio, who was my colleague and worked with me at Opiniones. And I was really flabbergasted. And of course, I didn't know who Madiba was. And I inquired afterwards, and Victor Gomez, who is a painter who lives here in Miami, he produces monoprints, told me that he was dying of hunger, muriéndose de hambre, as we say, in Cuba, because he wasn't selling and he wasn't being recognized or anything. And politically, the burning of the painting produced a tremendous excitement all over the world, and then he has become famous. So I wanted you to comment on that, because in your experience, what you have said is that this was very important, and indeed it was, and also very important, the Cernuda situation, because of the fact that after that, all the paintings from Cuba were coming here, and the Cubans were buying them. And the other thing is how hypocritical that Botifol had paintings of Cuban artists who lived in Cuba, but yet they criticized what the museum was doing. So, Ms. Pierce?
Thank you. Thanks for that information, because I didn't know that he had complained of that. I guess my uninformed reflection would be, I think those of us who maybe know more about Cuban history are more attuned to what a name like Ballard might mean, whereas I imagine a lot of sort of U.S. gallerists might not know about the familial connection. So I'm curious that he feels that actually had some effect on his career, but I don't know any details, so thanks for letting me know.
And let me just say that my famous relative, Andrés Duany, is not here, but anyway, same last name. I do think that Madiba's, the fact that Madiba was at the center of this controversy is very ironic, because at the time, and especially earlier on, he was not considered to be a revolutionary artist by any means. But the fact that he was living in Cuba, as well as Raúl Martínez and some of the others, already sort of branded him as an official artist. And I think in that context, in the late 1980s, that was pretty much the dominant view, that regardless of what you thought about the Cuban Revolution, regardless of whether you were in favor or against, if you stayed in Cuba, that was, good enough for some members of the Cuban American community to reject him. So you may be right. I mean, the fact that he became a much more established artist, and that he's, I think, one of the best-selling Cuban artists today, living artist, may have had something to do with this initial episode. But I think, again, the fact that I used it is because it sort of captures that moment in time in the late 1980s when, different, I think, 30 years later, including this exhibit, when it opened, it didn't create the kind of public debates and controversies. Not that it has been without any controversy, some of it is out there, but nothing compared to the intensity that surrounded that, very dramatic act of burning a painting.
There's another question.
Thank you. Which this discussion begs the next question. I noticed that in your presentations, and this for the entire panel, a well-renowned and I think respected Cuban artist, Rafael Soriano, was not included. Mm-hmm. And so just as we were discussing earlier, the panel mentioned, and my friend Olga Connor, that Madiba was not popular, and he was actually banned, and the painting was burned, etc. He was an artist from Cuba, in the island, living in the island. I think we could also ask why some artists, like Soriano, for example, or others, may not have received their due recognition because precisely they lived outside of the island. Is it because Cuba is sexy? Is it because the international community maybe banned Cuban artists who were living outside of Cuba as maybe not being, again, as meritorious? Is there a double standard here? And I'm not an art expert, but I noticed this.
You want to talk about that?
Yeah. I think that in every case, you have to think about the nuances of each situation on the island and outside the island. Because it kind of, sometimes it's kind of the reflection in a mirror. In the case of the island, those artists who left the island in the 60s and even in the 80s, who emigrate to any country outside, but particularly to the United States, were proscribed, were taken out of the history of Cuban art. I can say that with property because I studied there, and when I came to the United States, there were names that were not part of the studies I received, like formal studies I received in the university, that were not part of the curatorial project of the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes. But in the United States, it happens also that because of those political points of view that varies depending on the parties that are involved each time, that there were artists that, it's hard to create a continuous in the history of the Cuban art. There's a lot of lost names that in any case, when you talk about abstraction, you feel like there's one story in Cuba and there's another story that needs to be complemented. And I think that that's one of the merits, because this collection, we remember that we were talking about a particular collection that George Perez donated to the museum. So we are kind of, our papers are based. It's not that we don't acknowledge the importance of certain artists. Our papers are based in the specificity of this collection that was donated to them. And I think that one of the merits that for this collection to be now in the museum hands is especially that now the museum can see those if there's any gaps or if there's any trends that the museum needs to strengthen, to acquire other pieces, to look in a certain way, because there is nucleus around, in the exhibitions that need to be strengthened. And this is the way Tobias has taken a first approach to the collection, but it can be read from many other perspectives. And I'm sure it's kind of just going back to the previous donation that George made in 2013, and I remember that the exhibition and then was named Frames of Reference, right? And this is now, this new group of pieces is adding, it's becoming into that frame and is expanding that frame of reference and 10 years from now, I'm hoping that the Cuban collection here and at PAM, if Tobias does another show, it's going to be something different. It's going to have more names. It's going to be like it can provoke other teams on the table.
And Soriano is in the
Yeah.
collection, and we have a beautiful painting. And I think, Soriano is an interesting case, and I think, one might be his, living outside of Cuba, but it may have been the moment in Miami he was working in as well, and the visibility from the space of Miami outward as well. But I think that's changing a lot too. I mean, he's had some recent exhibitions, and I think that history is being revisited as well. So let's hope that that continues. And yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Please remember that we have more Cuban art in the collection. We're celebrating this particular donation in this particular way, and you'll see this collection being integrated into the rest of the collection, which includes Cuban art and other Latin American artists and artists from all over. We hinted at that kind of integration in the permanent collection shows here to talk about how it will kind of bleed into our other holdings in the future. But this is one, but also I tried to emphasize in the introduction, I was trying to structure into this presentation this idea that there will be multiple readings of each of the artworks and multiple histories or multiple approaches to each of these artworks, and each of them fit into different art histories. There are many art histories, and not just a linear Cuban art history, or not there's an abstraction history, there's a history of identity politics. There are many histories that these artworks can tell, or many stories they can tell within in multiple art historical narratives. So this was just kind of a way to hint at that multiplicity of meaning and that they can provide within the larger collection. So yeah, another question.
Yes, can you address some of the challenges that Tania Bruguera has faced in her work? And is she on the island? Is she off the island? That whole conversation.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, you probably know, but yeah, I mean, she's on and off the island. She's had, she lives in New York primarily, but goes, she was detained last year, 2 years ago. For her confrontations with the government. She maintains a very combative relationship, or like very much challenging the Cuban authorities when she is on the island. So and she's a constant voice sort of against the Castro regime.
Yeah, and also because what happened 2 years ago when she wanted to recreate the performance that she had done before in Centro with Fredo Lam, Susurro, remember? A Whisper of Tatlin. The Susurro de Tatlin was a performance she did before when she when I see the Antonia's piece, it kind of recall with that, because she's a performance artist, as many of you know, and she put like a podium for people to come and talk whatever they wanted freely for a minute, I think. So whoever was in the audience had the opportunity to come and say whatever they wanted. That happened, and then she wanted in 2 years ago, she wanted to do the same performance in Plaza de la Revolución. And of course, as you know, she was detained, and the Cuban authorities took off her passport for 2 months. And there was a lot of different positions on that, from artists, from the institutions inside and outside the island. I wanted to say 2 things on Tania. First, that she's an internationally known, probably the most known artist, contemporary Cuban artist outside Cuba, and that's way before that incident happened 2 years ago. She has lived outside the island for many years already, and also that particular performance and all that battle that Tobias was saying with the Cuban authorities is very consistent with her practice. She's a political artist, and if you look at other pieces she has done at the Tate Modern, for example, she's that confrontation with the institution, that confrontation with power, the barrier or where is the difference between art and politics and collective and all that is very, it's a kind of constant present in her work. The collection has 2 pieces of Tanya. They're not performance pieces. It's one of the, but it's represented in the collection as well. And I hope in the future, her presence can also grow.
Yes. Yes.
And if I may add something, I just mentioned Tania Bruguera in my own chapter because I think she's a perfect example of this recent blurring of the borders. I mean, this is a critical artist, as you've explained, who still keeps a residence in Cuba. She's still a Cuban citizen. She hasn't become a U.S. citizen, and she goes back and forth to the extent that she can. So again, if you compare this to the 30-year-old episode that I told you about earlier, it really is very difficult to then associate living with the island with a particular political position as opposed to living somewhere else, and then your art and your politics don't necessarily reflect your place of residence.
1 or 2 more questions? Go ahead.
Thank you for your discussion. Tobias, at the beginning you mentioned the imminent cultural change that hangs over Cuba. And I thought that would be a really kind of provocative way to ask about this sort of speculative future of Cuba in what is that, that is something that people mention, I think, a lot in the States, like Cuba is going to change. Maybe with a new political regime here, that is not as much as part of the conversation. There is the insertion of technology now. When you go to Havana, a lot of the parks, everyone gets Wi-Fi there, so everyone's looking at their phones. I mean, there is these small shifts, but I'm kind of curious to know about, people who've known so much about what's happening there politically. What is that cultural change? What is that shift that maybe is part of this anxiety that's coming up in the next decade or 2 decades?
I mean, I think it's a complex. I mean, I mentioned that because I think it's kind of. I was saying there's desires from here, from a U.S. perspective, for certain changes on the island, and then there's internal desires outward, and those different desires may meet at different times, but they may also, how a U.S. Perspective on what will happen to Cuba, what we imagine Cuba wants, may be very different from what happens internally in the desires from the island. So it's a little bit, it's a complex space, but I think, as we've talked about, when we have seen the opening up of Cuba, it has had major changes on the island, and the new economic possibilities and movement for people. We talked about in the 90s, people not being able to move or move it. And so these openings and closings have a real effect on the island, but they sort of they have a political resonance coming from here as well, which isn't always Cuba supportive in that sense. I don't know how you would comment on that.
Thinking about from the Cuban point of view, and it may not sound like hopeful, but I'm a little bit skeptical about whatever changes. I mean, thinking about institutional changes or the infrastructure of Cuba or whatever the government. One thing is when we talk about the government and the changes or not they were willing to do or to make, and at my personal point of view, I'm very skeptical and about any possible changes coming, like real changes coming from the government. But that's one thing. But the fact is that the artists themselves, and sometimes it's an individual, it's case by case. It's not something that is a group or a collective, a strategy. It's not something that's organized. It's not something that's structured. Sometimes there's artists who have had the luck to receive in their studio a well-renowned collector, and from there on, they are put in a very good known gallery. From there on, they are they are established in the market, and there's other artists who live here in Miami, and they are as good as those, and they don't get the recognition. So but it happens through the art history in general. It's not, we're now looking at the present, and sometimes we get alarmed by the present situations, but we have to think, how we can look at this present moment, how it's going to look in the future. The reality is that during the special period, for example, a lot of collectors, because of the situation Cuba was facing, because of the crisis, a lot of people visit Cuba. And the well-known 90s generation came from there. So we don't know. I cannot say it's good or bad. It's just a situation that we are analyzing. And there's facts that it's different in some ways, that there is more artists who open their studios as if they were galleries. And there's international galleries that are based in Havana. So there's a different scenario. And of course, since there is a different scenario, there will be different results in the future.
And I think things are constantly changing, and kind of communication and fluidity in and outside of Cuba has changed and continues to change. I think, but there's this sort of the fantasy of like when the embargo is gone and all of this money comes in, that there'll be this, Cuba will be incredibly transformed, that it'll be this, in an art world, maybe like a different art market. And who knows if that will actually, the way that sort of opening up will be interpreted on the ground, we don't know, and each artist, each, cultural practitioner will negotiate that. But this sort of, like, kind of the floodgates open, I think is a very, and that it's like suddenly like everything is transformed in a sort of a U.S. model, is a very, from a U.S. perspective, that I sort of resist as well,
And I just want to add to the discussion that I think one optimistic sign in the last few years has been the development of the so-called non-state sector of the economy, so cuentapropistas, self-employed workers, which would include artists. And just to give one specific example, I've been very impressed by a younger generation of filmmakers who have, for instance, in the past few months, have celebrated film festivals here in Miami showing their work, which is not well known outside of Cuba, and which is semi-independent, autonomous, alternative. They use those words in a fluid way as well, because sometimes they do get support from the state institutions, and sometimes they get support from the private sector, and sometimes they enter co-productions with Spanish producers and American producers. And this is new, relatively new, because again, prior to the 1990s, every film production in Cuba was controlled by the government. Now, the question is whether with the next president, whoever that person is, these changes will continue to proceed, or whether the Cuban government will control them and try to set back to an earlier period. That's an open question. But in any case, I think it's a healthy sign that there are more and more independent or semi-autonomous, if you will, producers, artists, filmmakers, musicians, and so on, that was not the case decades ago.
We'll end there, but I wanted to remind, we have a cocktail in the education lounge on the third floor that to kind of celebrate the closing of the exhibition, which is officially tomorrow. But we invite all of you to join us upstairs and continue the conversation together. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.